And I'll be going over the GameMaker Debugger for CPI 111. Before we start, what is a debugger? Well, a debugger is a tool to observe, test, and debug code by showing what values are being produced, what happens if those values change, and highlighting what values need to change in order to create the desired output. Why use it? It saves so much time, and when compiling multiple people's code together, that can be very, very beneficial. So, an overview of what we're going to go over. First off, what is a debugger? Why use it? How to run the Debugger View, along with its corresponding panels, including Graph Panel, Control Panel, Code Panel, Breakpoint Panel, Toolbar Panel, Call Stack Panel, Variable Panel, and Other Panel. After that, we'll be going over the code for a test project and a debugging demo with a bugged version of that code. And finally, going over more resources if you want to learn about these topics more in depth. To start off, running the debugger. You can click on the bug icon located to the left of your start button. This will run your program like normal, but it will alter the GameMaker program to have a debugger view. This debugger view has a couple of neat panels, including the graph panel, seen right here, resource view, call stack, code view, and this toolbar right here, which we'll be going into more detail with in a second. Some other panels important to note are the variables, breakpoints, instance, and other panels. To start off, we have the graph panel. This is useful for checking performance. As you can see here, it monitors how much memory and frame per second is being used, along with giving the average of both. Right now I have a fairly small project running, so it's averaging about 4,900 frames a second, which is pretty good considering the industry standard for high-performing games is about 60 frames per second. Now we have the code panel. When the debugger is first opened, the code panel should be empty. You can populate this with items by going into the resource view panel, call stack panel, or tooltip panel. Once you have the code up, you can see that unlike the normal code, GameMaker code is compiled at starting, so changes can't be made while it's running. That being said, while the code itself can't change, we can change some of the values of the variables. In this case, clicked, held, and released. Additionally, we can also add breakpoints to our code. For those of you unfamiliar, breakpoints are spots at which your code will pause. And this pause will allow you to see the values happening at that very instant to make sure it lines up with what you want to see. As you can see, I have two breakpoints here, one at if clicked and one at if held. I added these breakpoints by clicking to the left of the line number, and I can also toggle them off by clicking on them again. This is helpful for changing values. For example, in the step function, it changes every step. So to keep up, these breakpoints are very useful. Additionally, if you want to have lots of breakpoints, but you don't necessarily want to stop at every single one, you can go use the breakpoint panel to toggle them off. This will keep the breakpoints at their desired position and allow you to test what you want to test without having to remove and add them every time you switch between testing. Now, as mentioned before, the breakpoints cause you to pause. So in order to play, we've been given these three different tools, which allow you to control at what rate the project will run. The step into function will allow you to run the code line by line by line. Additionally, when reaching a user-defined function, like source button click right here, instead of moving to the next line, it will allow you to go into your function. This is useful because if there's an error within that function, you can go in and see it. There's also step over. Let's assume you know for 100% this function isn't the cause of your problem. Well, step over will run line by line until it gets to that function, and then it'll go over it. it'll still run the values, but you won't have to walk through it. And let's say you do happen to be inside a function that you know it is working, or you've figured it out, it's fine. Well, then you can use the step out of, which will step out of the function and go to wherever it was called from. Then we have the toolbar panel. If you don't want to use breakpoints, you can manually pause, play, stop, and restart the game window. This is useful for when you see a bug happen in real time. You can just click the pause and then you're good. Stop, unlike pause, will close the window, and restart will start the game window over. Then we have the resource view. This will list all the objects, rooms, and scripts inside your project. By opening up this window, you can see, currently I have a object button in my room. This object button also has a step and draw GUI event. And when I click into these, they'll open it up in the code panel. Then we have the call stack panel. The call stack panel shows the current event running. So while the project is running, it will remain empty because many stack calls are happening per second. But when you pause, it'll show exactly where it's at, or show where an error is at. So you can click into this and get where you need to be. After that, we have the variable panel, locals, globals, and watch. Watch, like the name suggests, allows you to watch different variable objects. In this case, I'm watching object button held, clicked, and clicked. And locals and globals, when paused or at a breakpoint, will show you the global variables and the local variables. This is useful for seeing the variables of a specific instance. Right now, you can see clicks is at 36. Then we have the instances panel. It will show all the current instances. Also sees the current instance running, so where you stopped at, and then the selected instance. This is good because if you want to compare your non-working instance to perhaps a outside instance that is functioning, you have the ability to compare them done by clicking on to the code of the current instance of interest. Then we have the others panels, which is also split in two. On the left-hand side, we have the profile panel, which once you start profiling, will show you the call count, time to complete, and steps needed for the different functions. This allows you to identify potential performance issue use very quickly. Then we have the buffers. While not explored deeply in this class, buffers are used to store data while waiting for other events. That's it for the panels. Now on to our test project called Button Click. It's a game about a button. The button has 3 states: idle, clicked, and held. On idle, the button animation is up. When you click on the button, you add 1 click to your score count. And now you're in the state clicked. If that button is continued to be held, you go to the held state. And you start the button down animation, so you can visibly see when the button is pressed down. And once that button is released, you move on back into the idle state. Okay, as you can see here, I have the project, and we have one room, and that is the button room. It has a button. Inside our button, we have a step and draw event. On step, we'll get clicked, held, released. When it is clicked, it will go to this script called script button click, which is located in here. And that just increments the amount of clicks. Going back to our button, you can see we have 3 states for clicked, held, and released, along with a image index to set our animation. And then draw GUI draws our click count. So let's try running this in the debugger mode. as you can see, an error occurred. Now you can read this, the object DML object button step 0. Alternatively, instead of having to look for it, since we're now in the debugger mode, it automatically brings that up right here. So we can see that it's line 2, clicked mouse check button, and it looks like instead of putting MB left, I put MD. One important thing to note is that GameMaker's variables will be highlighted either red or green. So, since we're in debugger mode, we can't edit. So we'll go over to here, back to our workspace, go back to the step, and instead put MB left. And as mentioned, it cannot be debugged now since we altered the code. So what we're going to do is we're going to stop, and we're going to run this again. And this time it pops up. But here's the problem. Instead of adding 1 point per click, it's acting as a hold event, so it keeps on adding. So, we're going to check out this in our variables event to see what values are coming from our variables. To see this in real time, we're going to click on this button called Enable Real-Time Debugging. And now you can see the values have updated. So when I click here, you can see it'll increment occasionally. So let's see what value becomes true when I hold this button. It looks like button clicked is 1 when I hold this button, and button held is 0. This is actually flipped from what we wanted. So instead, we're going to change mouse button press to mouse button. And we have to, once again, stop this debugging session to edit. Click into here, delete that, and add this here. So now we've swapped clicked and held. So now held has mouse button, and clicked has mouse button pressed. And let's see if that solves our issue. And now you can see we have a better button click. It increments as we want it to. But the animation isn't playing correctly. If we go to our sprite sheet and look at sprite button, as you can see, it's now at 0 frames per second. Just to see how the animation should look, let's put it on. And now when you press play, you can see the button darkens. But right now we're not getting that effect. So first I'm going to set this to 0. I'm going to set a breakpoint here to release, if released. So when playing, you can see it works correctly initially, but when you let go, it only lands by 1. Instead, it should be going that way. So now that we ran it normally, let's run it in debug mode. And pull up that window. You can see right now, this is just white because it's checking if released. Now, seeing as we haven't clicked anything yet, we can just step over this function and go. It'll keep going, running this step by step. You can see that here. Step, step, step. So. Now, as you can see, even with the debugger tool, one thing I forgot to anticipate was, while I'm clicking here, I can't click here. So, instead, we're going to do this differently. So we're going to pause this. Let's actually stop this. Let's toggle this. And instead,
we're going to add a new watch. We're going to go Object, Button, Released. And let's, oh, you can see I put 2 periods instead of 1. It's fetching the value. It's because that we have this in a real-time debugging enabled, and we make debug. Now the reason why I didn't do it automatic is because I closed the window. So, click, click. So that works. Now, going into variables, let's try this again. So now we can see that released is 0, even when I let go of the button. But it is working for 1 frame. So how I initially anticipated the check button release work is whenever the button wasn't being pressed, then it will have been released. But from the looks of it, it only is released the moment that I let go of the button, for 1 step after I let go of the button, and then it's back to false. So instead of doing released, first exit out of the debugger in locked mode. So instead of checking for released, let's do not held and not clicked. So click, and it goes back, just like that. And now we have our click button working, just as intended. If you're interested in learning more, I'll be providing the PowerPoint in the class Discord. There is the GameMaker Debugger documentation, which is the official GameMaker resource, the GameMaker Debugger overview video, which, while slightly less detailed, is a bit more clear to understand. Then we have the GameMaker Debugger overview article. This one probably has the most information out of all these resources. And then if you found the practice debugging session helpful, or the demo debugging, then I would suggest going to this link at live debugging problems. While the GameMaker version is slightly outdated, it really helps inform you of the debugging process, which goes past the language itself. There's multiple episodes if you're interested. Anyways, thank you. That's all.